Next, labor unrest in Cambodia's clothing factories. Workers are calling for fewer hours, better conditions, and higher wages. That raises a question. Are Western consumers ready to pay more for apparel? Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro reports. A version of this story aired recently on the PBS program Religion and Ethics News Weekly.
Back in the 1990s, Cambodia, impoverished and rebuilding after its genocidal Khmer Rouge years, took steps to give its new garment industry a competitive leg up. It agreed to a system of labor standards with minimum wages and a limit on working hours, union representation, and freedom of expression. All would be open to international inspection. Today, there are perhaps 400,000 garment workers in more than 300 factories in and near the capital, Phnom Penh, subcontractors to retailers and brands across Europe and North America.
Beginning from scratch less than 2 decades ago, Cambodia's garment industry has grown into the largest export earner for this country. 3 out of $4 that come into Cambodia come from the garment factories.
The key question is how much all of this has benefited workers, almost all of whom are female, or, if you listen to the unions, whether it has benefited them at all. Many factories have been plagued by labor unrest. Occasionally it's been violent. There have been frequent reports of workers fainting on the factory floor. Union leader Sher Moni blames unhealthy conditions and workers weak from malnourishment.
Workers have very low salaries, only $61 per month. You can't afford to live on that day to day. There's no insurance if they get sick, no retirement benefit.
Che introduced us to these workers. Like most of their colleagues, they are young, rural migrants living in tight shared quarters, supporting extended families back home.
We have to pay for the room, electricity, water.
In the evening, we just buy some fish and make some soup. Sometimes we have to keep part of it for breakfast.
Chem Save supports a farm family in a rural province 60 miles away, including her husband, her parents, and 2-year-old daughter.
I can only see her once a month. When I go home, she really misses me, so she hugs me, especially when I must leave only 1 day later. One time, she put some of her clothes in when I was packing. She wanted to come with me.
The standard 6-day, 48-hour week plus overtime leaves little time to travel and see family. Factory managers aren't sympathetic during family emergencies, they complained, and many workers are on temporary instead of permanent contracts.
Previously, we saw a lot of strikes, but those haven't happened recently in our factory because there are a lot of newcomers.
They're like legal slaves.
Ken Liu, who represents Cambodia's garment factory owners, sees a very different reality.
They are not whipped, they're not chained. They come to work willingly.
He says garment workers are on average paid much more than the $61 minimum wage, closer to $90 a month, higher with overtime. That's more than policemen, teachers, or most civil servants, he notes.
We have to put things in context. The per capita GDP of Cambodia for last year, as announced by the World Bank, was 908. So the average garment factory worker earns 40% more than national per capita GDP. If you use that as a gauge, I think any worker in America would be glad to get 40% more than national per capita GDP.
Cambodia's Minister of Commerce says factory owners have little wiggle room because they are no more than contract tailors.
They do not own the fabric, they do not own the brand, they just import the fabric, cut, sew, pack, and then sell.
Cham Prasid could impose higher wages in the factories, most of them owned by investors from China, Taiwan, Korea, and Malaysia. But, he said, that would be suicidal.
There is a lot of demonstration to ask for living condition, to ask to increase the minimum wage, and what happened? The investor just pack the sewing machine and they go home.
Or they go to another country?
They go to another country. So we have to compare that our price with Bangladesh, we have to compare our price with Pakistan or India, or even with China.
San Francisco-based Gap is the largest buyer of garments made in Cambodia. It also buys from dozens of other developing nations. Spokeswoman Bobby Silton says Gap, which owns the Old Navy and Banana Republic chains as well, has no plans to leave Cambodia.
We have very long-standing relationships with many of the vendors in Cambodia. It's been one of our top 10 sourcing countries for the last 10 years. So we are very committed to being there. And we think that the labor standards that they have put in place is one of the reasons why we continue to stay.
Ken Liu is not reassured. In 2008, when the global recession began, he says buyers, including Gap, cut back in Cambodia, forcing many factories to close. At the same time, he says Bangladesh, with lower wages and no agreement to comply with labor standards, saw an increase in business.
It just confirms our knowledge that indeed and compliance or labor standards is the icing on the cake. Price is the cake.
It is a race to the bottom. And Cambodia, to survive, we have to create something special.
Jill Tucker says Cambodia does have a special competitive advantage since buyers want to be associated with ethical labor standards. Tucker heads an agency supported by the UN and the U.S. government that conducts factory inspections for compliance with the labor standards.
In the olden days, by that I mean maybe 10 years ago, it was more of a cat and mouse game than it is now. And the really smart producers, I think, realize that, you need to treat your workers well to retain your, your workers, and that it's just not worth it to not treat your workers well.
She cites this factory, run by a Taiwan-based company called QMI, as an example. There's plenty of air and light and relatively good labor relations. All 10,000 of QMI's workers are on permanent contracts, and wages range from $90 to as high as $150 a month. That's well above the industry norm, but still below what unions say is adequate, given the rising cost of living, especially food. But Tucker says demands for more pay, however justified, are a tough sell given realities in the U.S., the biggest market.
I really wonder if American consumers are willing to pay significantly more for their apparel.
Really?
Yeah. The cost of apparel has only dropped over the past decade. None of us are paying more for our garments than we were 10 years ago.
We do need to think about what consumers are willing to pay, where we can source these goods to achieve, get the math to work for everyone. From a macro standpoint, I think it's a very complex issue.
Gap Silton isn't sure if consumers would pay more for ethically produced garments, and retailers, pressured by investors, aren't likely to ask them to do so, says David Schilling. He's with the New York-based Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility.
The companies are being evaluated every single day, and Wall Street is very much a part of that very, very short-term calculus. That needs to be broadened.
Schilling says consumer awareness campaigns have begun to bring results on environmental issues, and this will be broadened to include social issues like the plight of workers.
There's more and more advertising around, sort of ecologically sound products. I think more and more that's going to happen within the social space as well.
He says that couldn't happen fast enough for workers in Cambodia, and even more so, those in many other countries that have not committed to international labor standards.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at St. Mary's University in Minnesota.